Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the latest chapter of Ars Magica, taken from the subreddit HFY. All the relevant links are down below, and please like, comment, and subscribe like any good minion of the algorithm would do. And as always, I hope that you enjoy. Chapter 78. Being alive was something that was fairly new to it, keeping in mind that not everything was new. It had existed before it was alive, after all. It was just inactive. It was only until something happened, a spark, a flash, a brief instance of magic. And then it knew. It knew what it was, where it was, and why it existed in the first place. Of course, having a purpose in life is something that almost everyone strives for, even if they don't understand that that's what they're doing. Most animals and beasts seek purpose in simply thriving, in saying that they left the world behind with no worries and lots of children. Some plants simply just want to finally die, to hide away from the sunlight, wither and decay, until the pulsating energy which fills them empties, and then they can get on with learning about their soul without distractions. There's even some monsters which want to create glorious art out of emotion they eat. However, for something with an increased amount of intelligence, like a bite or a hypatia, a known purpose for their life is something which they do not want. Gods, of course, do not give purpose to everyone. There are only a select few classes, like champions, heroes, or chief clerics, which might be given purpose. However, all of these things have in common that purpose is given through class, not through their birth. So being born with a purpose is something that can be quiet, for lack of a better word, terrifying. So, it was with a great fear that the being lashed out at whoever had caused it to come alive, because in that brief moment it was scared of just being. However, it was for a moment as the inherent knowledge had finally settled into its mind. It was too late at that point in time, though, as its attack had already made significant destruction in the surrounding area. The temple which it had been housed, collapsing in on itself and becoming much like the scattered rocks which surrounded it. It could sense the things which had woken it up move away, their vibrations visible to it. For a second, as it watched two drift off, it considered sifting the water around them. The knowledge inside of it had led it towards knowing its true limits, and while it would get an enjoyment of a reversal of their direction and from the shapes that their faces might make, knowing that they could not escape his grasp, the knowledge inside his mind would not let it. This was something that it was meant to take seriously, that she was supposed to take seriously. She sighed, little globules of air and water rising up to the surface, as she willed herself to follow the duo back towards the surface, leaving behind the fallen temple and items glittering along its broken floors. As she rose, she went through her knowledge once again. While it was easy to know the surface of it, the implications were something which she had to actually think upon, which was somewhat difficult considering her nature. Her diving brought to bear two rather important facts and their correlations. The first was that she was a boss, and while the word filled her with power when she first knew of it, there were some things she was in charge of that she hadn't known until looking into the connections towards her surroundings. This led her to know how much power she actually had, when she was simply just a barnacle living off of a whale it lived on. So, her sense of humility was incensed inside of her constantly due to the very title which gave her power, than for any example that she'd been given. This, while something that would be initially antithetical towards her being, was something that she couldn't feel one way or the other about, except for perhaps the slight disappointment in her apparent size and eventual limitations. Because, while most water golems wished to join together and form themselves to become typhoons and huge swaths of sea, she herself could only ever live inside a bowl that was provided for her. It would bug her for the rest of her life at times when she could actually remember that it was an important facet to remember. The second actually involved the direction the dungeon had wanted her to take. From her initial knowledge, she simply had thought bosses were things that challengers to dungeons usually fought. However, there was apparent another case in which a boss was needed, and that was for exceptionally hard puzzles. She, of course, did not know what a puzzle actually was, as that knowledge had not yet been inscribed into her being. What had been was a set of hard set limits. She could not simply suck the water out of the challengers. She could not kill anyone, but maiming was okay. She could not sink the island in its entirety. She could not let the challengers simply drown to death. Finally, she could only bring up the temple once she was within the island, and any challenger had managed to say a certain phrase in common. She didn't actually know what that phrase was, as it was a measure against mind reading. However, the dungeon would let it know when the phrase was being spoken, and if it was mistranslated or perhaps incorrect in its ministrations, only when it was incorrect or they had perhaps taken the wrong path could she do any lasting harm against challengers. Being somewhat loose with the rules she was given, she could only assume that once someone got the phrase wrong, she could just kill them. So, with a smile of her beak and a descent from the higher train of thought, she breached the barrier between the air and the sea. At least, she tried to. Something about the air was angry at her being there, like the line was supposed to be there for a reason, and she had broken it entirely. Of course, she did not know whether or not she was getting the feeding right, but she just fixed the problem by surrounding herself in water of the greatest sea around the island before rising. With that, her general form laid still connected to the water around her, and her head finally peeked from above the surface. Her face naturally forming itself around a memory, one filled with a creature of the deep who had once inhabited much of the oceans, of tentacles, beaks, stingers, and ashen-colored scales. She couldn't quite get the color right, but she assumed from the commotion as she rose above the waves was as good a sign as any. It being much clearer through the air than anything that she could have listened to underwater. Her arms lifted out of the ocean to rest upon the sandy beach, a tide just barely reaching her elbows before receding, and her claws clicked in the air, barely grazing upon the bordering glass. As she got herself situated, she couldn't help but feel something vibrating through her. Looking down, she noticed that some of the challengers had some kind of ranged attack, although for someone of her size, calling it an attack would be the equivalent of calling a fly using a saliva to attack a normal-sized bite. In short, it did nothing to her. Something came unbidden into her mind from the frequency of the attacks, a rhythm filling her, echoing inside of her, until she noticed an unbidden tapping of her fin upon the undersea shore. Her knowledge failed her as to what was happening, but her being knew what it was, as surely as a form had pulled from these ancient seaside bide. This was music. And for a second, she was tempted to try out her forms of voice, but silence was all that returned when she bid open her mouth. Her knowledge helpfully informed her that she was forbidden from talking or letting out a sound while challengers were present. Her eyes narrowed in frustration as her claws clacked against the seaside. A sudden scream tore her away from the thoughts as she looked down. It appeared that she had accidentally crushed one, and it was still alive, judging from all the screaming. She cringed as the dungeon took some of her power from her. Hesitantly, she bid a part of herself to flow towards the crushed challenger as she started to seep into its wounds. More screaming could be heard, but she just let the other challengers let out their anger. She needed the concentration for something that, while inherent to her being, was not something she had practiced with, being as new as she was to the world. Her water seeped into the being's wounds, touching upon its blood. She bid it to travel the normal channels and pump its heart for it. Her water seeped into its muscles, flesh, and bones, replacing it all in a simulacrum of water. Then she pulled on something that, while not directly under her control, was something adjacent to her. To nurture him. Her water pulled at the blood, mimicking its form and ability as best she was able, before she bid that part of herself away, infusing it with green energy. She squinted her eyes, trying to see whether or not she was succeeding, and silently cheered as she found the wounds stitching themselves together. A cramp happened upon her leg, but she bit it aside as she finished administrations. Once all of the water had changed towards flesh and muscle, she let her control go, relieved that nothing permanent had occurred and the now familiar power that suffused her returned to normal. The dungeon having given back once she had corrected her mistake. She sighed as she had also realized that the challenger had stopped attacking her. She was a bit worried as time went on and she could feel part of her form crumble away into the very sand below her. She was thankful that the tiniest challenger realized no serious harm was meant upon them, even if she crushed them a little. Centering herself, she stood up and presented her chest towards the challengers, with the message the dungeon had given her appearing on her being. For a second, she was worried that they hadn't gotten the meaning. But after a few hushed voices and much quieter conversation between them all, she was gladdened that it wasn't the case. She was a bit sad about it, though, considering she couldn't understand the conversation that was happening. The knowledge provided to her never provided any kind of language besides the written word. So, at most, all she could do was hum, rather than belt out anything within what her being had provided for her. It was only a couple seconds later when two of the challengers went off, while one stayed with the still recovering little one. She tried to see what was going on, but a sudden sense of boredom came over her. She frowned, biting the message off as a form, before she went back down below the waves, not putting any more mind towards the challengers. There were more exciting things that she could do now that her initial part in it was all done. Now that she had form, that she had thought of existence, she wanted to see her domain for herself. Because while she did have a map of the entire floor, knowing it was there and experiencing it was two different things in her opinion. There was also the fact that she would have to actually check on whether or not some parts along the bottom of the sea which she lived in actually bordered upon void, as it stopped currently. There was nothing that would stop anything wayward traveling through the current to fall through and discooperate either from outside forces or something else. The knowledge within her did not tell her how it was dangerous, only that it was, even to her in her immensity. So she set out to first deal with the immediate dangers. If one of them had swallowed one of the challengers, she did not know whether or not it would decrease her being or not, given that she knew of the dangers and did nothing to protect them. The sea followed by her, suffusing her, giving it strength towards her movements. She could sense nothing within the immediate area. She didn't know why, but she felt that she moved along the bottom of the sea, going past the dune after dune of sand, that there should be some form of life down here. The knowledge said so, but nothing was here. The incongruity pulled at her, until a part of her split off, leaving her none of the worse for wear. If there was not to be any life, then she might as well be the life. Her mind left fragments of itself and copies as it split to become luminescent coral and fish flitting about see-through kelp. She smiled as she was given new experience to live through. She had thought that perhaps this would be semblance of what others of her kind might be like. However, even if the thought gave her comfort, the slowly advancing darkness did not. And indeed, her hunch was right. At the border of her world, pocketed between sand, rock, earth, and water, stood little pockets of void, either seeping into her domain, or perhaps it was just the world being built without completion. She couldn't say. She suffused the water around the void, which lay on the top of it, to harden, becoming ice and grey slush. However, even then it was simply nothing, as the ice slowly drifted towards the void and became nothing. Frustrated, she smashed the sand next to her. Cracks formed in the firmament, leading towards more void, but thankfully no new holes were forced into being. There was only one last thing that she could try, one last aspect of a being that she could pull at. Time would tell whether or not it worked as she intended, for what she pulled at was something not too many delve into. To understand why doing this might be so difficult for the water elemental, there's a topic that has to be descended upon, and that is the existence of aspects. In essence, aspects were not that much different in terms of power towards affinities. The only thing that differentiated them was the fact that affinities were for a specific confluence of power, such as absolute control over primal elements of earth, air, fire, and water. However, aspects were just something regular affinity touched could grasp upon through their use of the affinity. For example, an ice-touched individual might have some grasp over regular water, but have no control over the clouds within the sky. Now, that might be the only aspects that a person might have over their inherent natural affinity inclinations, but others could delve into the more arcane, more metaphysical of affinities. The most basic of these esoteric would have to be earth, in that they can hold over form an aspect of physical containment, stability, the aspect of steady control, and finally, foundation, the aspect of grounding creation. Now, not many would have access towards the more esoteric methods of controlling concepts. Only those who either had an in-depth knowledge of their affinity of research or ingrained into their very bodies could pull at the esoteric concepts. So, it is understandable for a being whose body was ingrained with the very principle of water to understand some of the more esoteric abilities. They had already comprehended the nurturing nature of water, as well as the flow of water's musicality. That one thing that had yet to touch upon, which they were trying for, was also the most dangerous of water's capabilities, as it touched upon a concept which could destroy her entirety if done wrong, that being erosion. She pulled at herself, willing itself to become a destruction that she wished to seek. She wished to impart upon the water around her. Her form quivered as the power slowly shifted by nature, as her form began to degrade. Quickly, she brought power out of her body and into the world, infusing the water in front of her and the mana in kind. And there, in her quickly fragmented hands, was decay. End of chapter. I would just quickly like to thank the T5 channel members and patrons: Caspar Arnholtz, Cam Maxwell, Parky, It's Difficult to Pronounce, Lord Azrakul, and Arcadian.